Yeah, so one I was thinking about recently in terms of sort of my development as a researcher, I mean, in terms of actually sort of particular moments, because you don't think about those in terms of particular moments. So I was remembering that I was at my first job was at a lab in Cambridge in England, and I had just graduated from Edinburgh University as a computer scientist and was working in this computer science research lab. They didn't have my office ready for me when I arrived, so they put me in somebody else's office, and I started browsing the books that he had. And he was a sociologist, and in particular, I pulled up a set of conference proceedings off the shelf, back in the days when conference proceedings were the things that were in books and could go on shelves, and started reading the papers. And it was in an area called Computer Supported Cooperative Work, or CSCW. And this was one of the first conferences that had been held on that topic. And it was sort of revelatory to me. Not because it was a new topic. It wasn't so much that there was just a new set of things that I could learn about, but it was an entirely different style of research than I was familiar with. So I'd been trained as a sort of engineer, as a computer scientist, and had a sort of computer scientist mentality about how it is one would go about building things and the kinds of exciting things that one could build. And reading the way in which computer science was being brought into conversation with sociology, with organizational science, with management science, with other academic disciplines in the conference proceedings I was reading, was really a sort of eye-opening experience in sort of recognizing that there was an opportunity to do work in a very different kind of style. And so interestingly, I think that has been a characteristic of most of the work I've done since, is that as I sort of, as a professor, I have the opportunity to sort of move from area to area. My work develops and evolves in different ways as I'm in conversation with different students. But often what's happened is it's not simply a move from topic to topic, but actually as a broadening or encompassing of different kinds of research styles. And so I think that actually was, and it's only prompted by your question, it's like thinking back to that little moment, but I think that moment was actually a deeply significant one in terms of the setting a direction for the way in which my research would evolve. Thinking about it in terms of writing and speaking is different again, I think. One of the things I find now as I train students is that they often would like me to be able to tell them useful, pithy little statements about make it like this and do that. And I wish I had those at my disposal, and I really don't. So I've been trying in my 10, 15 years as a professor to develop those and figure out what they might be, some of those rules of thumb. I think the most important one that I end up telling my students is that the biggest challenge in writing is to get out of your own head enough to remember and reconnect with what's actually interesting about your work, because after all, somebody who reads what you have to say about it is not as does not enter that moment pre-excited about it the way that you are, and I think that ends up being the challenge, is to try to imagine what this is like for somebody else who's encountering it for the first time. So as I said earlier, my work has sort of evolved in a variety of ways. So I was trained as a computer scientist. I work now in an informatics department, which brings together social scientists and computer scientists. And the sort of fundamental characteristic of the work is that it has that blend. So from a social science perspective, there's a lot more technology and technology development involved in my work than would otherwise be the case. And similarly to most computer scientists, my work looks like some form of anthropology or sociology, in that we're very concerned with people, and we're very concerned with the real world, and we're very concerned with what technology actually happens when it moves out into the world and takes on its own kind of thing. I think probably the most significant sort of characteristic of the work that my students and I have been doing for the last several years is the idea that thinking about information technology artifacts as sort of like theory objects, as objects that embed theories about the world. And the idea too that those theories might be worth unpacking and unfolding and revealing and reflecting upon as we try to imagine what kinds of theoretical commitments come with different kinds of objects, and how those limit what technology can do or might do or want it to do. So taking a view of technical objects as being not simply objects of engineering delight, but also actually as theory objects is relatively unusual within a lot of the areas that I've worked in, and is certainly one of the characteristics of the work that we've ended up doing. One of the areas where I've been thinking about the materiality of information technology lately is in sort of digital networks, right? And digital networks have of course all sorts of sort of material characters, right? They go to particular places and therefore they don't run in others. There's a lovely study that came out of UC Santa Barbara a few years ago, which was a study of the undersea cables that carry internet traffic around the world, and the competitions between various South Pacific nations, because where the cable goes, so also do other forms of economic investment in people. So on a very brutal base level, right, one might be interested in the materialities of those kinds of things, because one might want to try to recognize the way in which information technology takes on particular forms in particular places and so forth. But the other aspect of the materiality of network technology that I've been exploring lately is even to do with the materiality of the representations at work. So to give you an analogy, we do arithmetic calculations in the Arabic numeral set, right? A place-based system with the digits from 0 through 9. And there have been, and may well still continue to be, different kinds of numeral sets. But the sorts of numeral forms that you use condition the kinds or the ease of doing different kinds of forms of arithmetic. So in particular, multiplication and large divisions are easy to do with Arabic numerals, but very hard to do with Roman numerals when you don't have a positional system. Well, much the same is true of the kinds of ways that we represent things inside computers. We have databases, and we talk about databases as if they could store any kind of data, but they can't store any kind of data. And indeed, the very particular ways in which the representational forms in relational databases, which are the sort we most commonly use, then map onto the hardware architecture of a computer and its particular kind of arrangements, and what kind of things it can do quickly and what things it does slowly, and how that maps onto the storage layer. These are all material considerations, the examination of which requires looking at the connection between hardware and software and how they're actually manifest in particular computer systems, that really do shape how we can represent, move, manipulate, and organize data. And given that the representation, movement, organization, and manipulation of data is so central to the way that our governments operate, our large-scale bureaucracies, corporations, organizations, and institutions like the university, those things have all sorts of implications. And so the materiality there does sort of start to impinge upon the kinds of things that we imagine that we can do with computational systems, and the kinds of things that computational systems then go on and do for us in the world. Well, there's lots of answers to that question on different levels, I think. I think the first one is that particularly in the last 10 years or so, I think people have really begun to recognize from a very, the most sort of straightforwardly commercial perspective that that devices can be built so as to engage people's emotions, and that there's actually real value in doing that. It creates value for people. It gives value for people. And so the rise of an interest in design in general around information technology, both in terms of the physical objects and the interactive objects, has been recognized to have commercial interest. That's one thing. But I think that the more important thing is that a lot of the way that we've talked about designing computer systems for many years has regarded people as sort of, some strange form of robot. It's regarded them as having cognitive capacities. It's regarded them as having computational capacities, but neglected those things that actually engage us with the world, engage us with each other, and that affect how it is that we make use of the technology. If you imagine that nobody ever wakes up in the morning and says, I think of myself as a user of Microsoft Word. You use Microsoft Word in order to reach through the tool and to connect with other people, to do things in the world. And those are all the sort of aspects of the world that we sort of begin to sort of capture and enroll in an affective form of engagement and an affective form of analysis. But the other interesting thing I think that's come out of a lot of research around the affective aspects of interaction with technology is how deeply culturally and socially situated affect is as well, right? It's not purely a sort of question of physiological response, but is also a way in which I situate myself in a world in which certain kinds of emotional performance are acceptable, certain kinds of emotional performance are valid, certain kinds of emotional performance are appropriate, and the bounds upon that really become a sort of interesting lens into the way that both people and technology are culturally situated as well. So the affective exploration can lead us into other kinds of areas that have often, I think, been neglected from a technological design perspective, but seem to be really important to capture as a part of the human experience. I'm going to answer that question in a really sort of strange way. But so I'll tell you a story that happened to me at a conference a couple of years ago. We were sitting at a conference, and the conference was on ubiquitous computing. So it was on sort of a form of computing that involves wearables and things that you carry with you, things that are embedded in the world. And a group of us were actually just about to go to another conference, which was going to be held over Halloween. And so at this other conference that we were talking about, the theme was zombies and other monsters, because it was to be relevant for the time of the year. And one of the people sitting at the table with us at the UbiComp conference said, zombies, yeah. It would be really difficult to design for zombies. And he started listing the reasons that it would be difficult to design computer systems for zombies. And so one was, zombies' bodies are changing all the time as like bits of them fall off, and that would be really difficult. I don't know how to deal with that. And I was thinking, but all our bodies change all the time. That would be a real problem. And then the next thing he said was, zombies are undead, and therefore they live or are undead forever. And that's forever is a really long time, and I don't know how to build a computer system that's going to last that long. And I was thinking, well, we all have data that we've been carrying around with us for a long time, and we all build systems with the expectation that, I'll still be able to get to my digital photographs in my dotage. So actually, those problems of the long term are all ones that we have already. And so I think it was kind of interesting, right? The way the body manifested itself as a problem when he thought about designing for zombies. Was remarkable mainly for the fact that he somehow thought that the body didn't manifest itself as a problem for any of his other designs, which were designed around the idea that, you had two workable hands at any given moment, and that people were of a certain height, and so forth. And so sort of thinking about how it is that that technologies sit with respect to our bodies, and that the kind of the engagement is a bodily engagement, is curiously an area that I think has been under-examined. There's people in wearable computing, and there's people in some other areas who've begun to sort of recognize it. But the notion that bodies actually might play a role is I think a notion that could do with a lot more examination. Well, I think typical people are thinking a lot more about privacy now than they were even just a couple of years ago. I think the difficulty. Let's see. The most interesting. Let me start again. The difficulty with privacy research is that although there are a lot of very important studies that have been done, they've been done in sort of different areas. So there's been a lot of work in the legal area, and so there's a legal scholar called Alan Weston who's famous for some very comprehensive long-term studies that he did about people's attitudes towards privacy. But that came largely out of a set of legal considerations trying to think about privacy as a right, and how it is that right should be sort of manifest in the law. There are also a number of interesting studies that get done sort of more in the area of, say, social psychology, where people are concerned with the concerns people have about accessibility to their person or to their belongings. And so there are studies that have identified, for instance, the different kinds of degrees of openness or closeness that people might want to have at different kinds of places, and the different kinds of ways that social relations are mediated by access to the person or to objects. But I think the real challenge is to try and put those things together, to be able to do something that tries to take a sort of more comprehensive view, that takes the work in technology and the work in legal scholarship and the work in philosophy and the work in social psychology, and be able to stitch it together into a seamless whole of some sort. And part of the reason that's such a challenge, I think, is because the word privacy itself is really, I think, a fairly problematic term. It hides or obscures as much as it reveals. It doesn't really, it's very difficult to define. The closer you get to it, it sort of runs away. It's really difficult. The first paper I ever wrote about privacy is easily the most difficult time I've ever had writing a paper. And I went through 40 or 50 different versions before I could get to it. And what we ended up doing in the studies that I've done around privacy is trying to think about privacy not so much as a thing that people have, but rather as a way they have of acting. So instead of thinking about privacy in terms of possessions, something you could have more of or less of, something that you might have to give up or trade with someone for something else, started to try to think instead about privacy as a way that people have of acting. I can act with respect to information in a way that reflects or expresses certain kinds of private or attitudes that people might recognize as being private. So I'll give you one of my favorite examples, which comes from a study that really wasn't about privacy at all, but has been very telling for me. And it's a study done by a sociologist called Gary Allen Fine, and he did a study of Midwestern amateur mushroom hunters. And so he was an ethnographer, and so he goes and he works for months and years, collecting mushrooms with people, going to their meetings, trying to understand what their world is like, sort of from the inside. It helps that he liked mushrooms. So one of the things he noticed is that in the place that they were working, prized mushrooms like morels and chanterelles, they have a very short season, and nobody really knows when the season begins. And if you overpick a particular spot, then you won't get any mushrooms next year. So he would start to try to, he would notice that people would be very careful about not just not revealing where they picked their mushrooms so that other people wouldn't overpick the spots, but not ever asking somebody where they picked their mushrooms, because that would be rude. It would mark you out as somebody who didn't know the way things work around here if you were to make ask such a foolish question as, oh, where did you get these? And in fact, people would go to this particular lengths, not only not to ask, but not even to give the impression of having asked. It's like, if you ask someone, where were you this weekend? Oh, unless you were picking mushrooms, of course. Right? And the nervous laughter itself sort of indicates that a social boundary has been almost breached. And so this is really interesting if we think about it from a privacy perspective. Because what it shows us is that people are acknowledging the bounds of privacy, acknowledging the constraints around information without ever there actually being an exchange. It's not like I told you something or kept something secret. It's actually that it's not even been asked. And the reason it's not been asked is to respect a set of social norms and to mark out membership. This is how people mark out the fact that they're members of the same group. And it's really, I think of it just like, when you go home and tell your partner asks how's your day been, and it's not like I don't tell her how my day's been so that she'll love me more, right? It's not an exchange. It's not a commercial exchange. Rather, it's part and parcel of doing that kind of relationship. And so privacy then, when we look at it this way, becomes something quite different. It stops being something that we have, a possession, something we can trade like money, and it starts being a way that we all act together. And I think that opens up a whole new set of potential investigations for privacy. Ones that would steer us away in a technical domain from having, just a series of check boxes that say, I'll tell Liz this, but I won't tell Liz that. But rather ones that respect that and sort of start from the place of how do people interact with each other, and how do they interact around information, and how is it that our interaction is organized so as to orient towards the role that information might have or that action might have, in a way that we're actually sort of doing social work. And so that's been the shift for us that I think is important, from away from privacy as something that people have and towards privacy as something that people do. Well, the first thing, actually, before I answer that question, before we sort of think about what the strategies might be, there's a really interesting sort of like anthropological principle at work here, right? Which is the sort of the principle of the fictive norm. When you ask people, how do you protect your information? The most common answer you get is like, oh, a sort of like somewhat shifty, embarrassed, I know I should do more. I know I should really change my passwords more often and have more different ones. It's sort of like when you ask people, how often do you back up your computer? And I was like, oh, yeah, everyone else is backing up their computer more than I am. So everyone else protects their information better than I do. And it's actually true that everybody else protects their information better than I do. So I don't know what sort of strategies does one have? I've been thinking about this a little more just lately, actually, because about a month ago I spilled a glass of water on my computer and completely fried it. And so first, it took me a couple of weeks to get a new computer, and in the meantime, we're trying to get access to my data was the problem. And I was intrigued by how many people just said, "Oh, you should just store everything in the cloud." First, because I've got too much data to store it all in the cloud, but secondly, because I was just reflecting on how uncomfortable that makes me. I think one of the important things, as a general principle, is to just know where things are, and that's very difficult to do. Just to know where it is that our stuff is, such that we can make an evaluation of what's actually secure or not secure, private or not private, accessible or not accessible, it would seem to be the starting point for any kind of strategy to follow, and yet it's very difficult for us to actually achieve. So, my own strategies involve ownership. My own strategies involve having things in places that I know and I control and I manage, and being very selective about what lives in any other place. And always, and this is sort of the computer science in me, because a computer scientist in me as well, always assuming that any network is inherently insecure, right? So, I'm not one of those people, for instance, who makes a strong distinction between different kinds of groups on Facebook. Some people I'll tell one thing and some people I won't. That's just too difficult. You just presume that everybody knows everything. And otherwise work around what it is that one can actually control and manage. So in a sort of networked world, it's a curiously retrograde answer it's like, oh yeah, it's hard drives that live in my house, and that's where I need to be able to keep things. But I do think, and actually some of the research projects I've been involved in for the last couple of years have also tried to answer that question for people about where things are when your data travels across the network. Where does it go? Like, literally, where does it go? What buildings does it go through, and how many of them have NSA offices identified within them? So it is becoming increasingly difficult to do that. And yet, if you don't know where things are, it's difficult to imagine what a sensible strategy could be. Like privacy, trust is another of these terms, like privacy, which it's sort of like difficult to put your fingers on. Most of the work in psychology has certainly focused on the importance of face-to-face as something that as an underlying element in trust. But I think actually a more important element in trust is what happens over time, right? And one of the ways that that's important, I think, in a sort of digital communication context, then, is perhaps what we might call integrity. How it is that a sequence of actions add up to something. How it is that a historical pattern adds up to something that is trustworthy or not, that's trusted or not, that's trustable or not. And so I think one of the things, when people often imagine the digital to be a realm of the inherently inauthentic, right? So notions of trust get sort of opposed to notions of sort of digital presence, because after all, trust lies in the face-to-face encounter, and after all, trust lies in what's a sort of real connection between somebody and between people, not the sort of fake stuff that happens online. And yet, one of the things I think is important about online interaction is the fact that it happens over extended periods of time, and often, of course, with our record as well. And so the trust then begins, I think, to lie in something different. Trust begins to lie in the integrity of a pattern of action, in the integrity of a sequence or a data trace that then becomes a source of trust. So, and you can imagine these things. I mean, if we think about it from a communication perspective, this is also to do with how it is that, for instance, somebody is a consistent voice for a particular position, or acknowledges, even when they change their mind about something, that they're changing their mind about something, And so those are sort of sources of integrity. Those are sources of integrity we might imagine in other forms of media. Those are sources of integrity that we might imagine as we read the newspaper or read, books or articles by somebody whom we've been sort of looking at for a long time, and the rest of it is how those things sort of build up over time. And in the digital domain, intriguingly, even though it's often, thought of as a domain of the immediate and a domain of the now, because of the ways in which records obtain and the ways in which they sort of accumulate over time, you actually have that notion of building up a record much more than you might have in other kinds of sites. So I think trust becomes a sort of interestingly different topic, or it grows up in different kinds of places. It's to do with a sequence of encounters, and that's something that also, I think, begins to give us an idea of the role that sort of communication and media play in that other aspect of trust, which is our trust in institutions and our trust in organizations, and our trust not simply in people, but in the many different social entities that sort of shape our everyday worlds. And there again, that sort of notion of rooting trust in a history and in a pattern of action and its integrity, rather than in a moment or an encounter, sort of takes on an extra kind of layer of significance. University education, by and large, teaches us to be specialists. It sort of it gives us depth in particular kinds of areas, and it trains us to be expert in particular kinds of domains. And I always remember a definition that somebody once gave me of an expert, right? So an expert is somebody who is more likely than average to come to the right answer for a question, but also more likely than average to ask the wrong question in the first place, right? We all ask the kinds of questions that we expect, that we know that we can get answers to. I think the most important thing to try to bear in mind as we, with whatever expertise a degree from university gives us as we go out into the world, is precisely that one about not necessarily the key not necessarily being giving the right answer, but asking the right question in the first place. And that often requires us to recognize that our domains of expertise and specialty are limited. And so trying to understand and maintain an openness towards how it is our expertise intermeshes with other people's, and to recognize that we all carry with us particular kinds of blinkers that make it hard sometimes to see the big picture, is almost always my advice for people graduating from university, because we've spent so long helping people to be experts in civil engineering or computer science or the analysis of historical manuscripts or whatever it is, and yet to be all the sort of challenges that we actually then sort of face, not just individually but socially as a state, as a nation, and on, are challenges that require sort of being able to combine and link different kinds of expertise. So being able to to recognize the limits of your knowledge, and to be able to recognize the way that different people have of thinking about things, and different domains and disciplines have of framing problems in the first place, I think is probably the most important challenge for people to take away.